So what's the idea behind ChatGPT's code interpreter feature? Well, one very important use case for using ChatGPT, which we'll also explore in this course, is to use ChatGPT to generate code, because ChatGPT is capable of generating code for a vast variety of programming languages. But without Code Interpreter, you then have to take that generated code and execute it on your own, which often also means that you need to install or set up extra tools that might be required to execute that code. With Code Interpreter, ChatGPT is not just able to generate the code, but it's also able to execute that code. It's able to execute those generated code snippets in an isolated, restricted execution environment. And therefore, certain restrictions, to which I will come back, will apply, and at this point of time, it's also just Python code that can be executed. Nonetheless, this is of course an extremely useful feature that can be used for a broad variety of use cases. You could use this feature to perform mathematical calculations, and you would no longer face the danger of running into hallucinations, since with Code Interpreter, ChatGPT is now able to simply write the code that will then perform the mathematical calculation, instead of trying to predict the result, which can sometimes be wrong. You could also use Code Interpreter to generate dummy data or extract information from files or transform file content. You can use it for data science to load and clean data, and of course to analyze data and build charts. And you can also use it for image editing, for example to analyze and transform images or do other exciting things with images. And there might be more use cases where you want to use Code Interpreter, because even though these here are probably the most important and common use cases, as with ChatGPT in general, it's of course ultimately your imagination that's the limit. Though speaking of limits, Code Interpreter definitely has some limits, because the code that gets generated and executed by ChatGPT is executed in an isolated execution environment provided by OpenAI. So that code that's generated and executed is executed on machines owned and operated by OpenAI. And therefore, certain restrictions set by OpenAI do apply. For example, at the moment, OpenAI only provides an execution environment for Python code. So you can't execute other code with Code Interpreter at this point of time, though that of course may change over time. In addition, the code that is being executed in that environment does not have internet access. So if you're trying to run some code that would need to reach out to the internet, for example to crawl and summarize a website, that code would fail and would not work. In addition, this environment of course also has no access to your local hard drive, because, as I just mentioned, that code's running on some machine owned and operated by OpenAI. It's not running on your system, and it therefore doesn't have access to your system. Which, of course, in general is a good thing, but if you're trying to run some code that needs to work with data that's stored on your machine, that code also would fail, though ChatGPT actually does allow you to also upload and download files when using Code Interpreter. Though of course you should definitely take a look at OpenAI's privacy policy to understand how they might be using or storing the data you're sharing with them, for example through file uploads, because you might not want to share super sensitive internal company data, for example. At least you should be aware of how OpenAI is going to use that data. Now, in addition, in that execution environment, there's only a selected list of extra code packages available. And with that, I mean extra packages that contain some extra code that could be used to execute your code. For example, there are packages that help with image manipulation or with QR code generation. And whilst this environment that's provided by OpenAI comes with many pre-installed utility packages that might be needed to run the code you need to run for a given task, there also might be certain tasks you might want to perform with help of Code Interpreter that just won't work because a certain package that might be needed might be missing. Though in our experience, Code Interpreter and ChatGPT are doing quite well when it comes to identifying such situations and are then often able to generate and execute some alternative code that does not require a certain package that might be missing. Last but not least, another important Code Interpreter restriction is that it's only available for ChatGPT Plus users and not in the free version. So now that we know what Code Interpreter is and how it works and which restrictions apply, let's start using it and let's start diving into some important prompting techniques. But of course, first of all, you have to make sure that you can really use this feature. You will find a ChatGPT option with Code Interpreter when selecting the GPT-4 model. And once you enabled that specific version of the model, or that version that has this Code Interpreter unlocked to be precise, you're ready to use it. And now with that enabled, ChatGPT will try to use Code Interpreter if it helps ChatGPT solve a certain problem in a better way, or if it allows ChatGPT to solve a problem it would not be able to solve otherwise. For example, with Code Interpreter enabled and selected, we could now ask ChatGPT to generate 20 random integer numbers, which are simply numbers without decimal places, between 1 and 100. And now, instead of guessing or predicting such numbers, as ChatGPT might normally do, it will indeed generate some Python code and execute that code, and then give us the result of that code execution. Now, what's great about this Code Interpreter feature is that by default, all the work that's being performed is hidden from you, so that if you don't have a programming background, you don't have to deal with the details of what just happened. But if you want to take a closer look, you can do that by clicking here on Show Work. And once you do that, you'll see the actual code that was generated and the result of executing that code. Though that result is then of course also output here in a prettier way by ChatGPT. What's also important to note is that when using Code Interpreter, a single chat session, so all the messages in a single chat, share the same execution environment. Therefore, if I now send a follow-up message like multiply every number with 2, ChatGPT will again use Code Interpreter, but it will use Interpreter in that same execution environment. And therefore here, if we take a closer look at the work performed, you can actually see that it uses the same random numbers variable, as it's called in programming, that was generated in the previous response from ChatGPT. So instead of regenerating the entire code and losing results from previous calculations, it keeps those results and it keeps the same execution environment, and we can build up on those previous responses and on the results from previous code executions when sending follow-up messages. So that with that here, in this case, we indeed do get these numbers here, which are based on the result we got from an earlier message and code execution. Now, for certain tasks you might want ChatGPT to execute for you, you also might need to share data with ChatGPT. For example, here I have an AI text file locally on my system, which is simply a file that contains some text about artificial intelligence and how it evolved over the last years. Now, for some reason, this entire text is written in all lowercase characters. And I might want to use ChatGPT and Code Interpreter to properly capitalize this text, so that, for example, the first word of every sentence starts with a capital character. So therefore, here I need to share this file with ChatGPT. Now, of course, you did learn that ChatGPT does not have access to your hard drive, though. But thankfully, you can upload files to ChatGPT when using Code Interpreter. Because when using Code Interpreter, and only then, not in the other modes, but when using that, you have this plus button here, which allows you to upload a file. And you can therefore then, of course, use this button to select and upload a file. And there is a limit regarding the maximum file size you can upload here. At the moment, it's 100 megabytes. And whenever you do upload a file, which you now also could delete and re-upload if you accidentally uploaded the wrong file, but whenever you did upload a file, this file will automatically be taken into account by ChatGPT when it uses Code Interpreter. So this file is made available in that isolated execution environment provided by OpenAI. And therefore here we could then, for example, tell ChatGPT to convert the text in the uploaded file to properly capitalized text. And when we do that, again, ChatGPT will use Code Interpreter to generate and then also execute some code that does indeed use this file to capitalize the text in there. In this case here, it actually generated two separate pieces of code, and it did indeed try to use a library in that code that was generated that is not supported in this environment here. And as I mentioned before, fortunately, ChatGPT is then often able to detect the problem and fall back to an alternative solution, like it did here, where it then generated and executed some alternative code that also solves the problem. Now, that solution might not be as good as the first solution it tried. For example, here, when it comes to capitalizing the text, it's now using a simpler approach, which might not handle all edge cases, but it will produce a result, and often that result will be absolutely fine. As it is here, where I am indeed getting my properly capitalized text. Now, as you can see here, ChatGPT also actually detects that because it had to use this simpler alternative approach, certain special words, to be precise, acronyms that might be stored in this text, like NLP, were not capitalized. But it even asks me if it should enhance its solution to do that, and since we're sharing one single environment here across multiple messages, as you learned, I can simply say, yes, please also capitalize acronyms and nouns. And with that, ChatGPT will again produce some new code that takes the result from before into account and that does now aim to produce a better result. Here you see that it simply also now looks for AI, NLP, and GANs in our text, and that it will then manually transform all these words to uppercase variants of those words in the final text. And with that, NLP, for example, is properly capitalized.